between March 19, 1847, and September 14, 1853. 14 altar boys disappeared without a trace from St. Joseph's Catholic Church in rural Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. Not a single body was ever recovered. Not one credible witness ever came forward. The church records from those 6 years gone destroyed in a fire that oddly left every other document in the rectory untouched. What makes this case truly chilling isn't just the numbered missing children, it's the pattern that emerges when you study the dates, it's the methods, and the deliberate erasure of evidence. 3 weeks ago, renovation crews at the old Sacred Heart Municipal Building unearthed something long buried, a light-lined box hidden beneath the foundation. Inside it, they found 127 pages of handwritten testimonies, sealed church correspondence, and photographs the Diocese of Pittsburgh had reportedly ordered destroyed in 1854. These documents prove the truth. These weren't isolated tragedies or boys running away to chase adventure. These disappearances were methodical, calculated acts that turned a house of worship into a hunting ground, and the most trusted figure in town into its deadliest predator. The few who survived and finally broke their silence after nearly 170 years described rituals masked as prayer. Children returned from private sessions, deeply changed, a pattern of psychological control so refined that parents themselves delivered their sons into the arms of a monster. Tonight, you'll hear the full story. The church tried to bury testimony, once sealed under threat of excommunication, and evidence suggesting St. Joseph's was just one link in a much longer, darker chain of events. Before we descend into the shadows that swallowed Sacred Heart, a warning: this channel isn't for everyone. Only those brave enough to face the monsters who wear masks of holiness should continue. If you're ready to join a brotherhood of truth seekers, those who challenge the power structures built to hide the unthinkable, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments which state you're listening from. Few channels dare to bring you the stories we reveal here. In this one, may test even the strongest nerves. What happened at St. Joseph's began with the arrival of a man whose charisma hid a hunger, and whose faith ran as deep as the graves he would dig. The hills of western Pennsylvania in 1845 were a tapestry of hope stitched with desperation. Irish immigrants fleeing famine had carved lives from stone and soil, clinging fiercely to their faith. Sacred Heart wasn't even a true town, just a scatter of wooden homes clustered around St. Joseph's Church, seeking shelter from spiritual storms, perched on a rise above Mill Creek. The church's gray stone walls and modest bell tower stood, watch over the countryside, visible for miles. The 312 souls who lived there had given all they had to build it, dragging stone from local quarries and felling trees from the thick woods. They were poor. Most worked in the dangerous coal mines, carved into the hills, while others toiled in Pittsburgh's steel mills 2 days away on horseback. But they were faithful, clinging to Catholicism like armor against the Protestant hostility that met them in America. Then came Father Cornelius Alley. He arrived on a rain-drenched Tuesday in October 1845. He was 38 years old and carried himself like a man born to lead. Tall 6 feet, even with prematurely silver hair and piercing blue eyes, he spoke with the smooth, educated voice of a Dublin seminary man. But he understood hardship. He told them he had served in Boston and Baltimore. He brought with him glowing letters of recommendation from bishops whose names carried weight in Catholic America. Their previous priest, Old Father McKenna, had died suddenly the month before, found collapsed in his garden, peaceful-faced, as if he'd chosen to step from life into eternity. For weeks, the parish had waited, their requests for a new priest, seemingly lost in Philadelphia's bureaucratic fog. So, when Alley appeared, bearing documents stamped with Bishop Francis Kenrick's seal, authorizing his assignment. His arrival felt like divine intervention. Within weeks, Father Ali revitalized the community's spiritual life. His sermons drew crowds from distant settlements. His Latin was perfect, his grasp of doctrine unmatched. He quickly established a proper altar boy programs, something old McKenna had never gotten around to. Boys began learning the sacred rituals that could one day lead them to priesthood. Parents competed to have their sons chosen, seeing it as a path to education and a life their own poverty had never allowed. The church became a reflection of both the congregation's faith and Ali's refined vision. He commissioned stained glass windows honoring Irish saints Bridge Columba and Patrick. Their stories resonated with the immigrant spirit. He decorated the altar with brass candlesticks paid for through socials and donated labor. The crowning achievement was the bell tower. Ali had it fitted with a clock mechanism and a new bronze bell. Its chimes marked the hours with heavenly resonance. But it was his bond with the altar boys most impressed the town. Michael Flanagan, the baker's son, once struggled to read, now spoke Latin with ease. 10-year-old Tommy Sullivan discussed theology like a novice seminarian. Patrick Donnelly, the blacksmith's boy, declared he'd pursued the priesthood moved by Ali's scholarly and spiritual authority. The boys served not only Sunday Mass, but weekday liturgies Ali instituted for the community's soul-deep enrichment. They learned to prepare wine, tend candles, assist in complex rituals of the Catholic year. Ali said their training needed privacy. So he began holding special sessions in the church basement where relics were kept and distractions were few. Parents noted changes. Their sons grew solemn, devout, mature in spiritual matters. Seemed like growth, a blessing. They didn't yet see the shadow behind the light. The boys began to speak, less of childhood games and more about their divine calling. They grew close not just to each other, but to Father Ali, forming what appeared to be a sacred brotherhood that elevated them beyond the ordinary concerns of daily life. Mary Sullivan, young Tommy's mother, was especially proud of her son's transformation. The boy who once spent afternoons chasing frogs along Mill Creek now spoke solemnly about the mysteries of the Eucharist and the importance of unquestioning obedience to God's chosen servants. Whenever she asked about his private lessons with Father Ali, Tommy's gaze would turn distant. He would talk in hushed tones, cut about sacred knowledge and special prayers, secrets. He wasn't allowed to share with anyone outside the brotherhood of altar boys. What no one understood, what none of them could have conceived, was that the man they so deeply trusted was methodically selecting and grooming his victims. He was using their faith as both shield and snare, turning their children's devotion into the bait for a harvest that would claim 14 young lives. And it began. On the feast of St. Joseph, winter had only just begun to loosen its grip on the hills of Pennsylvania. March 19th, 1847, dawned clear and bitterly cold. Frost shimmered on the windows of Sacred Heart's simple homes. The feast of St. Joseph, one of the most sacred days in the Catholic calendar, was a time for special masses, shared meals, and the warm joy of community. The bell tower chimed at dawn, just as it had every morning for the past 18 months. But this would be the final time its bronze voice rang without the shadow of tragedy beneath it. 12-year-old Michael Flanagan, the eldest and most experienced of Father Ali's altar boys, had been chosen to assist with the early morning mass, an honor that filled his mother with pride. Bridge Flanagan pressed his freshly laundered surplice until it shone like snow. She stood at the kitchen window as he set off down the familiar path to the church, his prayer book clutched to his chest, breath fogging in a cold air. He was supposed to be home within 2 hours, in time for the traditional breakfast of soda bread and bacon. But when 2 hours became 3 and then 4, Bridge felt a sick unease grow in her chest. Michael was never late. Not for meals, not for chores. Not without good reason. She walked to the church, expecting to find him assisting with preparations for the noon mass, but the building was nearly empty. Only Mrs. Catherine Morrison was there, arranging daffodils on the altar. Father Ali left hours ago, Catherine explained, adjusting a vase. Right after the dawn service, he said he had urgent business in Pittsburgh and wouldn't return until evening. I assumed Michael had gone home with you. Search began at once. Every family in Sacred Heart joined in. Men who should have been celebrating spent the day combing the nearby woods, shouting Michael's name until their voices echoed off the limestone cliffs that framed Cleague. They dragged the deepest pools, where a child might have slipped beneath the thawing ice. They checked abandoned mine shafts, questioned every traveler on the roads to Pittsburgh and Johnstown. Father Ali returned at sunset. His horse was lathered with sweat, and his face wore an expression of grim concern. He had, indeed, traveled to Pittsburgh, he explained, to meet with Bishop Kenrich about expanding the Altapoy program to neighboring parishes. The bishop had been deeply impressed by the spiritual growth of Sacred Heart's young men and hoped to model the program in other rural communities. When told of Michael's disappearance, Ali's response appeared perfectly appropriate. He immediately organized more search parties, led prayers for the boy's safe return, and spent hours comforting the devastated Flanagan family. But when 3 days passed and no trace of Michael was found, Father Ali called a media gathering that would set the tone for all the tragedies that followed. The church was packed that Thursday evening. Nearly every adult in Sacred Heart filled the narrow pews, faces pale with fear. Father Ali stood before them, cloaked in black, his silver hair glowing in the light of dozens of flickering votive candles. His voice carried a solemn weight, each word shaped by his Dublin accent, each phrase steeped in spiritual gravity. "My dear brothers and sisters in Christ," he began, eyes sweeping the crowded room, "we are gathered tonight in sorrow and in search of understanding. Young Michael Flanagan has vanished from among us. Despite our tireless efforts, no sign of him has been found in this world." The room was silent, every ear straining for answers. "But I must share something that weighs heavily on my soul," Ali continued, lowering his voice to a near whisper. "Michael came to me in private 3 days before the feast, burdened by a terrible guilt, a sin so severe that he feared eternal damnation. People leaned in, breathless. He confessed to stealing communion wine from the sacristy, not just sips but entire bottles. K shared them with Protestant boys from nearby settlements. Of course, he taught them to mock our rituals. K performed obscene parodies of the Mass, laughing at what we hold sacred." A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Michael's parents sat frozen in the front row, disbelief painted across their faces. Their son had always been faithful, never once rebellious. "I counseled him," Father Ali went on. "I reminded him of God's mercy, that forgiveness is always possible for those who truly repent." He explained that he had assigned the boy a special penance to spend the night of the feast in solitary prayer within the church, to ask God's forgiveness, to reclaim his soul. "When I left for Pittsburgh," he said, his voice catching slightly, "Michael was supposed to stay and pray until my return." Then, after a long pause, Ali concluded, "I believe the shame and fear overwhelmed him. I believe he ramped our parish, our community, perhaps seeking the same boys who led him astray. Or perhaps," Ali suggested, "the boy had fled to the cities seeking anonymity, a way to escape his shame. We must pray," he urged, "that he finds his way back to us, to quit, into God's grace." It was a masterstroke in manipulation. Father Ali had offered a story that explained Michael's errand while quietly discouraging further inquiry. Who would go searching for a boy accused of sacrilege? Parent would want their child associated with someone who would mock the very faith that held the town together. The congregation accepted Ali's version because the alternative that their beloved priest had lied, or, worse, that something dark had happened within the sacred walls of St. Joseph's, was too terrifying to contemplate. But Margaret O'Brien, who cleaned the church twice a week and knew every stone in its construction, noticed things that gnawed at her peace like rats behind the walls. That morning, preparing for the feast day mass, she had found Michael's prayer book discarded on the sacristy floor. The leather cover was stained with something dark, something that didn't smell like wine. The altar candles had burned nearly to the base, but their wax was misshapen, stretched, and cooled in ways that suggested they had been moved around multiple times during the night. And then there was the basement door, slightly ajar. Father McKenna had always kept that door locked. The basement was dangerous. He'd said stone steps and rough floors made it unfit for use. Margaret had only descended once, years before, to help retrieve Christmas decorations. She remembered a simple, dusty chamber with nothing but crates and cobwebs. But that morning, a new smell had drifted up, incense mixed with something organic and rotten sweet. It turned her stomach when she cautiously mentioned what she'd seen to Father Ali. His response was swift and chilling. His expression hardened. The warmth drained from his blue eyes, replaced by something cold and sharp. "Margaret," he said softly, almost kindly, but every word was a warning. "I understand that grief and confusion can lead good people to imagine things that aren't there." He stepped closer. His tone remained calm, but the pressure in his voice seemed to press her backwards, toward the pews. The mind creates stories to fill the emptiness tragedy leaves behind. He continued, but spreading wild speculation about sacred places is not only unwise, it's sinful. He explained that the church basement held relics, holy objects that required careful handling and special blessings. Any odors, she noticed, were surely from the incense used to sanctify them. "I would hate to see you burden yourself," he added, "with the sin of bearing false witness against your priest, your church." Margaret said nothing, but inside, she flinched. The rebuke struck like a slap. She went back to cleaning, but from that day on, she kept her suspicions locked away like dangerous relics. Still, you notice things, small inconsistencies that began to form a pattern. So she started writing them down in a private journal. Little observations, odd comments, details that seemed unimportant on their own, but began to form something far more disturbing when seen together. The official search for Michael Flanagan ended after 1 week. His parents clung to hope for months afterward. In his memory, Father Ali created a fund using donations to buy new religious texts and to expand the altar boy training program. The basement, once dismissed as unusable, was now being renovated for advanced spiritual instruction. His life at Sacred Heart resumed its outward rhythm of labor and worship. But something invisible had shifted. Seed had been planted, a seed that would one day grow into terror. What no one knew, what no one could have dared to imagine, was that Michael Flanagan had never left St. Joseph's. His body was buried in a hidden chamber beneath the church's stone floor, surrounded by artifacts and remnants of rituals that would have shattered the faith of the entire congregation had they been discovered. And Father Ali had already chosen his next offering. The altar boy program continued. Families remained eager for their sons to participate, still believing it was a path to spiritual growth. But subtle changes had begun. Ali's sermons took on a darker tone. He spoke of hidden sins, divine punishment, and the absolute necessity of obedience to God's chosen representatives. He warned of spiritual warfare, a battle for the souls of children, of enemies who used doubt as a weapon. "The devil is cunning," he would say, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "And he especially targets those who serve at the altar." The boys, he said, needed special protections, special training, and that training could only happen in sacred spaces, blessed places. Hidden places, group sessions were replaced with private ones. one-on-one instruction with the priest in the church. Basement now, fully renovated and dedicated to advanced religious study. Parents noticed their sons changing, but the changes seemed, at first, like signs of spiritual maturity. Tommy Sullivan, now 11, and the senior altar boy, had grown deeply devout. Visiting clergy were awed by his knowledge of theology. His mother, Mary, often wept with pride, but Kathleen Murphy noticed something different in her son. Danny, he'd always been a happy, talkative boy. After starting private sessions, he became quiet, withdrawn when asked about his training. He gave vague answers, speaking of sacred mysteries and special prayers that couldn't be shared outside the brotherhood. More troubling were the physical signs. Danny lost weight, though he ate normally. Shadows deepened under his eyes. His hands developed a subtle tremor, especially when Ollie's name was mentioned, and his voice flat. Stint reminded Kathleen of sleepwalkers from her childhood in Cork. He began speaking about ancient Catholic rites, obscure religious practices from distant cultures, Latin phrases that he said only the most spiritually mature were taught. When asked where he learned them, he only said, "Father Ali is teaching us about the true church, the one that came before the corruption." Then came the nightmares. Danny would wake up screaming about the dark place under the church, and the man in shadows, who isn't really Father Ali. He described flickering candles with colored flames, voices chanting in painful tongues, and rituals that left him feeling hollow. Kathleen began speaking to other mothers, and discovered she wasn't alone. Timothy Walsh had developed a stutter, but only when speaking about church. Brian O'Connor, once full of life, now sat in his garden for hours, silent and still, staring into nothing. Patrick Donnelly, who once dreamed of becoming a priest, now flinched at the mention of Father Ali's name. But when Kathleen tried to raise concerns, she was met with dismissal. Some mothers insisted their boys were simply maturing. Others told her to stop being overprotective. Ali had made sure of that. He had told parents that their sons were being introduced to spiritual disciplines that required secrecy. Speaking of these rituals, he warned, would weaken their power, expose the boys to evil. True love, he suggested, meant trust, obedience, silence. He framed any doubt as an attack on the faith itself. In a community already embattled, where Catholic identity was their only shield against poverty and prejudice, questioning Ali felt like heresy. Parents who sensed danger found themselves paralyzed, torn between instinct and faith. And then, exactly 1 year after Michael's disappearance, on the feast of St. Joseph in 1848, happened again. Tommy Sullivan never came home. Father Eli claimed the boy had been chosen for a sacred overnight vigil ceremony practiced by ancient Christians, requiring only the most spiritually advanced altar boys. This time, the story was more elaborate. He announced at Sunday Mass that Tommy had been selected for a divine mission. Bishop Kenridge himself, Ali said, had called for the boy's help in spreading the faith to Catholic settlers in the Western Territories. Tommy's destination, he explained, had to remain secret to protect him from enemies of the church. He produced documents bearing official seals, teased with elaborate praise for the boy's spiritual gifts. The congregation, mostly illiterate, accepted every word. Tommy's parents, Mary and Patrick Sullivan, were heartbroken but honored. Their son, they were told, had been chosen for something extraordinary. But Margaret O'Brien, still quietly observing, had seen the signs. The basement door had been left ajar again that morning. Tommy had vanished. The heavy scent of incense still hung in the chapel air, but now it mingled with something more sinister, organic rot that clung to the rafters like a warning. Margaret had noticed Father O'Malley's odd attentions in the weeks leading up to the feast day. He lingered with Tommy after services, dismissed the other altar boys early, and whispered to the boy in tones that left him spellbound. More disturbing was what Margaret found while cleaning the sacristy the morning after Tommy's supposed departure. His wooden cross, a small, carved relic from Ireland. It was the boy's most treasured possession, gifted by his grandfather before succumbing to fever on their Atlantic voyage. Tommy wore it daily, swore it protected him, and believed it anchored him to his heritage. He wouldn't have left it behind, not for any honor, no matter how grand. When Margaret brought this up to Father O'Malley, his demeanor shifted with unsettling speed. His explanation was unnervingly rehearsed. Tommy, he said, had left the cross intentionally as a spiritual tether to Sacred Heart while he served in the West. But then his voice hardened. He warned Margaret that suggesting otherwise wasn't just misguided, was dangerous. Such rumors, he said, could jeopardize the church's mission and provoke Protestant hostility. Then his tone dropped, cold and measured. Margaret said, eyes narrowing, I'm beginning to wonder whether your constant questions indicate a deeper spiritual issue, perhaps something that needs confession and correction. The message was clear: silence, or be marked, branded, perhaps even punished. Margaret said nothing more aloud, but she began to take notes, watching, listening, piecing together the patterns around Father O'Malley's dark ministry. As 1848 bled into 1849, his control over Sacred Heart deepened. He introduced new traditions, said to be ancient Catholic rites, midnight masses for altar boys only, prolonged fasting, and confessions that lasted 4 hours. To outsiders, the results were impressive. The altar boys recited doctrine with eerie precision, showed fierce piety, and spoke about spiritual matters with unsettling maturity. Bishops called it a model for Catholic education. Some even suggested replicating it elsewhere, but beneath that success lay something rotten. Father O'Malley wasn't selecting victims randomly. He was grooming the entire community, conditioning them to offer up their children, their trust, and their blind faith. He turned belief into a blinding force, shielding his rituals from scrutiny and cloaking his pretensions in holiness. The darkness that swallowed Michael Flanagan and Tommy Sullivan now spread like a blight. By the winter of 1850, 5 altar boys had vanished from St. Joseph's. Even the most devout parishioners could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. Father O'Malley's explanations grew more elaborate. The boys, he claimed, had been called to seminaries in distant cities, sent on missions to convert Protestants, chosen by God to live in secluded monasteries with no outside contact. But the pattern was always the same: weeks of private sessions, behavioral and physical changes, and then a final ceremony from which the boy never returned. Each time, parents were shown papers, fed divine promises, and told their sons had received sacred callings, too holy for earthly interference. Questing the church's will, they were warned, could harm their sons' eternal souls. But the cracks were beginning to show. Sean O'Connor, father of Liam, who vanished the previous fall, took to drinking at Murphy's Tavern. He spoke in fragments that disturbed those around him. The sounds at midnight, he muttered, one night, not prayers. It's Latin, but wrong. Hurt your teeth when you hear it. Okay? He described lights moving in the church, basement, and shadows that didn't match the number of people inside. Children's voices singing songs that no Christian child should know. Melodies that seemed to echo up from somewhere far beneath the church floor. Mary Gallagher, a sleepless widow, living beside the cemetery, had her own tale. She'd seen white-robed figures moving through the graves under moonless skies, carrying bundles toward the old mausoleum that held Sacred Heart's founding dead. The figures didn't walk. They jerked and glided like puppets on invisible strings, but worse were the soft cries from unseen children, calling out like lost souls searching for their mothers. And over it all, Father O'Malley's voice, lower than it should be, reciting words she couldn't understand, words that made her shut her windows and pray until sunrise. At first, such tales were dismissed as the ravings of grief-stricken minds, but a pattern emerged. James McKenna, nephew of the previous parish priest, discovered a journal in his late uncle's effects. Revealed a chilling account of Father O'Malley's arrival. Father McKenna had grown wary of the new priest almost immediately. When he reached out to confirm O'Malley's assignment with the bishop, there was no reply. O'Malley's teachings blended Orthodox Catholicism with older, forgotten traditions, ones McKenna could not trace to any church text. The case seemed obsessed with the church's foundations, asking about the stone used in its walls and whether any burials had taken place on the land before the church was built. When McKenna mentioned old tales of German settlers who practiced folk Christianity on the site, O'Malley showed intense interest, not skepticism, fascination. The journal's final entry was brief but haunting. Something ancient stirs beneath this sacred ground, something waiting for the right hand to awaken it. I fear I've failed to keep the wolf from our fold. That night, McKenna died. No injuries, no known cause. But those who saw his body said his face bore not peace, but resignation. Everything came to a head in March of 1851, exactly 4 years after Michael Flanagan's disappearance. Patrick Donnelly, now 16, went to his father with a story that shattered sacred hearts, carefully preserved illusions. Patrick, once O'Malley's favorite altar boy for his intelligence, had seen through the priest's lies behind the locked doors of their cottage. He told his father everything. The private sessions began as harmless instruction, advanced Latin, deeper liturgical knowledge. But soon, Father O'Malley introduced strange elements, teas, in languages older than Latin, symbols he claimed were older than the church itself, breathing rituals to open their spirits. The lessons took place in chambers deep beneath the basement rooms Patrick swore didn't exist during Father McKenna's time. The walls were carved from living rock, painted with symbols that seemed to twist and shimmer if stared at too long. The candles gave off light, but their shadows fell in impossible directions. The incense, floral and decaying, made it hard to think clearly. Worst of all, Patrick insisted the missing boys weren't gone. They were still there, changed. He'd seen them during a midnight ceremony. Their eyes glinted like animals, and their bodies moved as though controlled by something else. Father O'Malley called it the true communion, and it was only the beginning. They spoke in voices that sounded layered, as though several people were speaking through them at once, voices too inhuman to belong to children. And they served the priest in ways that Patrick refused to describe in detail, only saying they made him physically sick when he tried. "They're not dead," he whispered to his father, pale as wax and trembling. "But they're not alive either." "Not really." He paused. "Father O'Malley calls them his eternal altar boys. He says, one day we'll all join them. He's been preparing me special lessons about embracing change, surrendering to the sacred hunger. He says I'm almost ready." James Donnelly, a man whose belief had endured the potato famine, the Atlantic crossing, and the hardships of building a life in a hostile land, found himself confronting a terrible truth to believe. Patrick meant accepting that their priest was no savior but a predator, that the church he trusted was now a trap, and the faith that had defined their very identity had become a weapon against them. But to ignore Patrick meant gambling with his son's life, as 5 other families had already done and lost. The choice James made that night would divide Sacred Heart forever and uncover horrors beneath St. Joseph's Church, darker than anyone dared imagine. The confrontation didn't begin with violence or fury, but with quiet dread. One February night in 1851, 3 fathers sat around James Donnelly's kitchen table, sharing whiskey and secrets too terrible to speak aloud. Sean O'Connor hunched over his drink, hands stained with coal dust, trembling as he described the sounds he'd heard in the night. Michael Walsh stared into the fire, his eyes hollow as he recounted the strange behavior of his son, Timothy. How he had begun to stutter, to sleepwalk, and to weep during his prayers. And James relayed Patrick's account of the secret ceremonies in the basement and the transformation he feared was already underway. These were not reckless men. They were immigrants who knew the danger of questioning power, who learned to keep their heads down in order to survive. But they were fathers first, and that instinct, the same one that had carried them across the ocean, now warned them something was terribly wrong. "We can't go to the sheriff," Sean whispered. "A Protestant lawman won't take Catholic panic seriously. And even if you did, what do we have? Night sounds, odd behavior. A priest who's maybe too fond of the boys. They'll laugh us out of the courthouse." Michael nodded grimly. "And the bishop's no option either. Colley's got documents, seals, and letters of endorsement that look real. We accuse him without proof. They'll think we're the problem. They'll send him somewhere else and scatter us." James set down his glass, his face hardening. "Then we get proof," he said. The plan they formed was terrifying in its simplicity. They would observe the church on the nights Patrick said the rituals took place. If they caught anything evidence of abuse, anything unnatural, they'd take it to Pittsburgh, to the church hierarchy. If they found nothing, they'd accept the consequences in the following weeks. They made their preparations, checking oil lamps, sharpening blades, and loading Sean's old hunting rifle. But as they prepared, new evidence emerged, evidence even more disturbing than Patrick's stories. Timothy Walsh's condition turned out to be far worse than a stutter. Dr. Klaus Brennan, an elderly German physician who cared for Catholic families across the region, found symptoms that alarmed him. Timothy's reflexes were slow, his pupils stayed dilated in bright light, and his body temperature was unnaturally low. Brennan associated these with chemical exposure or poison. Worse still, he found scars, small, precise incisions forming deliberate patterns on Timothy's arms and chest. When questioned, the boy claimed they were holy marks, symbols Father O'Malley had carved during blessings to protect him. They were healing cleanly, too cleaned, done, it seemed, by someone with medical training. Patrick's state was more alarming. He often stared at empty corners, responding to unheard voices. When his father pressed him, Patrick said O'Malley had taught him how to hear the saints, how to listen when heaven speaks. But the voices weren't all saintly. They talk about the hunger beneath, Patrick whispered during a lucid moment, the price of communion. They told me where the others went, what they became. They serve something older than Christ, something that wears Christian symbols to hide what it really is. They call it the ancient shepherd. As the horror and sacred heart deepened, the men knew what had to be done. If this story is chilling you to your core, share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit like to support this investigation, and subscribe to follow every new revelation in this haunting saga. March 15th, 1851, 4 days before the anniversary of Michael Flanagan's disappearance, the three fathers positioned themselves around St. Joseph's Church, armed with nothing more than weapons, instinct, and desperation. Sean O'Connor took cover behind the old mausoleum, eyes on the main entrance. Michael Walsh concealed himself near the bell tower, watching the basement windows, and James Donnelly, guided by Patrick's hand-drawn map, prepared to approach the church directly and uncover the truth. For 3 hours, there was only silence. The wind in the trees, distant wolves, the creak of old wood. T began to wonder if they had let grief deceive them, then dashed just after 2 a.m. light flickered in the basement windows, and the nightmare began. The sounds came first chanting, not in any Latin they recognized. The words twisted in their ears, leaving a metallic taste on their tongues and a throb behind their eyes. Beneath the chanting, something beat like a drum, but organic, wet. And above it all, high and sweet, were the voices of children singing, in perfect, terrifying harmony. Michael Walsh, peering into the basement, would later say, the lights didn't behave like candlelight. They changed colors from warm yellow to electric blue to a blood red that seemed to throb like a heartbeat. But it was James Donnelly who witnessed what no man should ever see. He approached the basement side entrance Patrick had marked, but the door was ajar. From it came warm air that reeked of incense, wax iron slaughterhouse rot. James descended the stone stairs, heart pounding, to the bowels of the church. What he saw would haunt his dreams forever. The basement had become something. Ancient Roman, pagan, monstrous symbols covered the walls, carved so deeply they looked like veins in the stone, writhing in the candlelight. Shadows moved opposite their sources. The air was heavy with smoke, and something worse, something alive, in the center of a great chamber stood a black altar, carved from a single piece of stone, slick with dark stains. Around it moved 7 figures in robes, not the humble vestments of altar boys, but intricate garments embroidered with shifting, light-drinking sigils. Beneath the hoods were faces James knew and did not know. Michael Flanagan, Tommy Sullivan, the other missing boys. What altered? Their eyes gleamed like animals. Their limbs moved in perfect unison, as if marionetted by an unseen hand. And when they chanted, the sound emerged from multiple mouths in impossible harmony. The 6th figure was Patrick, his son, not fully changed, not yet gone. He moved like the others, but something of him remained, the last sliver of humanity. And at the center, leading the right, stood Father Cornelius Ali. His silver hair shimmered. His eyes burned with a cold, ancient brilliance. But the man James had known was gone. In his place was something else, something wearing a man's skin like clothing. And it was only just beginning. The figure conducting the vile rite moved with an unnatural elegance, its limbs bending and flowing as if unbound by bone or flesh. Its voice was not but many interweaving tones that harmonized into something neither wholly human nor completely comprehensible. The authority he radiated was suffocating, like invisible chains pressing against every surface in the dim chamber. James stood frozen, a spectator to something ancient and foul, as the ritual built to a fevered crescendo. O'Malley lifted his arms over the obsidian altar, chanting in a tongue far older than Latin words that made the air vibrate and the shadows twitch. The altar boys, no longer fully children, joined in with a song that rose from impossible depths, voices that sounded as though they came from beneath the earth itself. Beautiful, yes, but horrific. A harmony of innocence defiled, twisted into servants of hunger that defied human meaning. Then James, overwhelmed by what he was witnessing, stumbled backward into a ceremonial candle. The sound of it falling rang through the stone like a shot. In an instant, 7 sets of eyes snapped toward him, and blinking, hungry and cold, for a moment that seemed to stop time. James looked into the faces of children he had known all his life. Fans saw only strangers gazing back. Then Father Ali uttered a word, harsh, wet, and ancient hand. The boys moved toward James, gliding like water, yet landing with a crackle of splintering bone. He turned and fled, survival driving out every other thought. Behind him came not footsteps, but a hissing, scraping sound, like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. Outside, nearly collided with Sean O'Connor and Michael Walsh. Both were pale with terror, babbling about unnatural things seen moving among the graves. Without a word, the 3 men fled into the woods, not stopping until exhaustion forced them to the forest floor. Only when daylight touched the trees did they dare speak of what they had seen. 3 days later, the confrontation began. Bishop Francis Kendrick arrived at Sacred Heart with church investigators and a heavy wagon filled with damning documents. None of the witnesses had dared report what they saw, but similar stories had reached the bishop from Baltimore, Boston, and Philadelphia. Missing altar boys, visiting priests with glowing credentials, communities too frightened or too reverent to ask questions. The real father, Cornelius O'Malley, Kendrick would reveal, had died in a seminary fire in Dublin in 1832. The man claiming to be him was a stranger and entity whose name did not exist in any record, whose trail vanished into a blur of stolen identities and forged authority. The impostor was no mere charlatan. His theology was deep and accurate. His documents, precise to the last seal. It spoke of knowledge of access that suggested he had once truly been within the church, before he turned to something darker. On March 19, 1851, 4 years to the day after, Michael Flanagan, vanished Kendrick, confronted the false priest during morning services. What he found was no normal congregation. The townsfolk sat stiffly, blank-eyed, their mouths moving in perfect, soulless rhythm with O'Malley's twisted Latin. It was a language the church did not teach. The boys at the altar were worse, mechanical, euphoric, and synchronized in a way no child should be. When Kendrick asked to speak to them alone, they turned as one, watching him like wolves. Their answers were perfect to perfect, harmonized voices, scripted responses, and eyes that reflected light like mirrors in moonlight. And when Kendrick insisted on seeing the basement, the mask fell. O'Malley's facade of gentle piety vanished in a breath. His eyes blackened. His voice dropped into a register that seemed to shake the walls. "You have no dominion here," he snarled. "This place was sanctified to powers older than your carpenter God powers your church mimics without understanding." He towered, though his height didn't change. He spoke in layers, voices beneath voices, and when he raised his hands, the altar boys formed a circle around him, moving in patterns that bent vision and sound. Windows shattered. One priest vomited. Another collapsed. Hands clutched to bleeding ears. But Kendrick had come prepared. The texts he carried weren't just legal indictments. They were ancient counterrights. A ritual, not to banish, but to bind, to force the creature to show its true face. What emerged was a nightmare flesh warping, eyes blooming across its scale, and skin peeling to reveal black veined translucence. When it screamed, glass exploded, and 3 priests fell screaming. Yet the ritual was held, and then the children broke. The spell snapped. 7 bodies fell to the ground, convulsing. When they lay still, 5 were lost as empty, breath gone. But 2, including young Patrick Donnelly, began to scream with human voices, real ones, voices of frightened boys who hadn't spoken freely in months. The false O'Malley, now cornered and stripped of disguise, made one last attempt to reclaim control. His words echoed with the command of ages, but this time they failed. His illusion was broken, and those who had worshipped him now saw clearly. James Donnelly clutched his son and ran, joined by other parents too long silenced. Behind them, as they fled the cursed church, the creature howled, a sound like the gates of hell slamming shut. Its harvest denied at the final hour. The official records detailing what transpired at St. Joseph's Church on March 19, 1851, were sealed under Vatican directive and buried for nearly a century and a half. They wouldn't be unsealed until 1998, when a global shift toward institutional transparency forced the Catholic hierarchy to confront long-buried sins. Within those pages, investigators uncovered a case so disturbing it had been deliberately hidden. The false priest, known as Father Ali, was not an isolated dynamo bot. It's part of a broader phenomenon church investigators had tracked for generations. Entities of unknown origin had developed a terrifying ability to infiltrate religious communities, assuming the forms and identities of legitimate clergy. Bishop Kendrick's final report, couched in the veiled language of ecclesiastical diplomacy, described the being as a non-human, malevolent intelligence. It exhibited unnatural capabilities, mortality, shape-shifting, and the capacity for mass psychological manipulation. Yet, it wasn't the creature's supernatural traits that disturbed the church. Most hit was how systematically it weaponized faith itself by donning clerical robes and invoking holy authority. It gained unchecked access to children whose families never questioned a priest's motives. By appealing to spiritual obedience, it ensured silence from its victims, and by embedding itself within an institution that prioritized devotion over doubt, it thrived undetected. Its evil mistaken for divine mystery. 5 altar boys perished during a ritual meant to bind the entity. They were quietly interred in Sacred Heart Cemetery under the false cause of a sudden fever outbreak. The grim truth of their drawn-out suffering was suppressed, considered too horrific to share, too damaging to a church relied upon by vulnerable immigrant communities for hope and belonging. Patrick Donnelly survived, but the boy who returned home bore no resemblance to the child who once dreamed of priesthood. Subjected 2 months of psychological torment and unholy influence, he suffered lasting neurological trauma, seizures, amnesia, and long catatonic episodes. He never spoke of what happened, only screamed through nightmares of subterranean vaults and whispering voids. The other survivor, Timothy Walsh, recovered more physically but not entirely. A severe stutter and uncontrollable tremors prevented him from becoming a blacksmith like his father. He withdrew from society altogether, becoming a forest-dwelling hermit who ventured into town only for supplies. Locals would later describe his strange conversations with unseen figures and replies in voices not his own. The town of Sacred Heart never truly healed. Families fled westward, seeking fresh starts in new churches, never speaking of the spiritual betrayal that had shattered their trust. The church building was sold to the county, repurposed for equipment storage, and its basement sealed in concrete. Yet even that could not contain the psychic rot that had taken hold. Strange phenomena followed the fleeing family's children, speaking languages they'd never been taught, objects shifting of their own volition, and voices echoing through empty rooms after nightfall. Dr. Klaus Brennan, who treated Timothy Walsh, documented years of what he termed residual spiritual trauma symptoms, afflicting entire families long after they escaped the false priest's grip. The entity that impersonated Father O'Malley was never captured. Bishop Kendrick's ritual may have forced it to abandon its disguise and flee Sacred Heart, but clues suggested it had relocated, taking on new forms within other parishes. Reports trickled in from across the Midwest, charismatic priests with pristine credentials, but subtle irregularities noticed only by the most discerning of parishioners. In 1867, 16 years after Sacred Heart, altar boys began vanishing from a German Catholic village in Wisconsin. Investigators discovered unauthorized basement chambers, cane symbols carved into walls, and witness accounts of rituals fusing Christian rites with older, darker practices. But by the time church authorities intervened, the perpetrator had disappeared, leaving behind only trauma and ruins. The last chapter of the St. Joseph's case wouldn't be written until 1923, when the old church was demolished to build a courthouse. Construction crews uncovered basements far deeper than blueprints indicated. Within them were chambers carved from bedrock, bearing signs of recent use. Ritual markings from Bishop Kendrick's reports were found etched into the walls, fresh, not centuries old. More horrifying still were the personal belongings of missing children from nearby towns, laid out in sacrificial patterns on blood-stained altars. The blood-like substances defied chemical analysis. 14 child-sized skeletons were unearthed beneath the stone floor, ranged in symmetrical formations, encircling a central space marked by repeated ceremonial use. The remains were reburied with Catholic rites, but the workers who handled them experienced haunting dreams of children singing hymns in dead languages and shadows that moved without cause. Some crew members resigned, citing eerie whispers from the excavation during night shifts. Dr. Margaret Thornton, forensic anthropologist, called to examine the remains, confirmed the bones belonged to children between the ages of 8 and 16. The most recent showed signs of death occurring within the previous 5 years, proof that the evil once housed in St. Joseph's had outlived its original cover-up. Her final recommendation, submitted to both civil authorities and the Pittsburgh Diocese, urged a full consecration of the courthouse site before continuing construction. That advice was ignored. CAT incidents persisted, tools relocating on their own, concrete foundations fracturing in symbol-like shapes, CAD, and ghostly choruses of children's voices during early morning hours. The courthouse opened in 1924. It functioned for 80 years, but its legacy was marred by inexplicable illnesses, psychological disorders, and a steady churn of staff unable to stay long. The building was finally abandoned in 2003 due to mounting structural problems and the reopening of hidden records sealed for over 150 years in a lined a box beneath the earth. This story serves as a chilling reminder. Evil can wear the holiest masks. Predators may hide behind titles we're taught to respect. The 14 altar boys of St. Joseph's were failed, not just by a monster, but by a system that chose silence over truth and reputation over the lives of children. Let their story be a warning. True vigilance means listening to our instincts, even when it means questioning the sacred. Do you believe the being once called Father O'Malley found new victims in other places? Or was it finally stopped by forces beyond our understanding? Have you ever witnessed authority being used to demand blind obedience, even when it felt wrong? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story chilling and want more tales that expose the darkest corners of America's spiritual past, like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. We'll see you in the next episode, where another long-buried truth comes screaming to the surface.